Hey everyone, this is Colin. First, thank you for your patience today, especially for those of you who take my 9 a.m. class. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to cancel class sooner, and I apologize if you came all the way to campus. For those of you who take my 12 o'clock class, hopefully you saw the announcement soon enough that you didn't come to campus if you didn't need to, but if that happened to you, my apologies as well. So, what I want to discuss today, and please know this is something that we will discuss over the next couple of weeks. This is not something that I'll just discuss today in this video and then leave it to you to sort everything out, but I want to begin this conversation about how to incorporate borrowed material into your research essays, which is to say you ideally have or will have all of this researched material. You need to know how to correctly and accurately include that information and, more importantly, include references to that information in the body of your research essay itself. And I meant to say this before, I am home with a sick child. Hopefully I'll be able to do this in time before he needs me for something. So let us do our best. But today I am working exclusively from this particular document, how to quote in your essay using MLA. So again, we're thinking at this point of the body of your essay itself, not the works cited page, not the citation page. So when you make reference to borrowed material, you basically need, in addition to the borrowed material, two things. You need something called a signal phrase and something called an in-text citation. So I want you to imagine, and I'll show you examples in just a moment, but I want you to imagine you have perhaps a direct quote, something from a source on your works cited page. That language, because it's a direct quote, appears in quotation marks. But it's not enough just to have language that appears in quotation marks, because pause and think about it for a second. Does that tell your reader anything? Well, it might tell your reader that it's borrowed material, but it doesn't give any indication of where it's from, how and where you found it, and maybe more importantly, if the reader themselves wanted to go and read the entire, whether it's a book or an essay, it doesn't provide them any information or any indication of how they could do that. So again, if we're imagining within the body of your essay, in addition to that borrowed material, you need two things: signal phrases, in-text citations. Here is an example of a signal phrase. And again, for time purposes, I won't read all of this, but think of a signal phrase as something that customarily appears before borrowed material, like a direct quote. It might give your reader, if you have a single author, an indication of the author's name, perhaps their credentials, etc. But it could be something as simple as this: Paul Krugman, and again, my apologies if you can hear my son coughing, but Paul Krugman, American economist and professor of economics at NYU, argues. That's it. That's all you need for a signal phrase, which is to say something you would use to introduce borrowed material like a direct quote. A couple of things to notice, and I have all of that language here. Present tense verbs. So argues, writes, suggests, not argued, wrote, or suggested. This is important. And I'll spend a moment near the end indicating where you can find a possible list of present tense verbs, because obviously at times you would want to vary the verbs you use, because otherwise things might become a bit redundant and repetitive. But this is basically it. You could write signal phrases as simple as this and satisfy the assignment requirement. So again, signal phrases, it's language you use to introduce borrowed material, and it could be something as simple as this. And you'll also notice that I provide, well, this is for the citations. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But you'll also notice that you could at times, or you may need at times, to mention multiple authors. If you have more than one author, the formatting there is basically the same, but instead of mentioning one author's name, you would mention two. So imagine it's Paul Krugman and Janet Johnson. So Paul Krugman and Janet Johnson Wright. Again, depending on if it's a single author, multiple authors, if you don't know the author's name and you just have the title of the essay, we can discuss that later, but this is your basic formula. What information do you know? Hopefully, ideally, it's the author's name and then a present tense verb. So those are your signal phrases. They appear before the borrowed material. Now, after the borrowed material, whether it's a direct quote, a paraphrase, or a summary, you need something called an in-text citation. And I explain what those are here. Basically, an in-text citation is if you have the author's name, their last name, and if you know the page number or numbers, the page number itself. Notice there's one space between the author's name and the page number. There's no comma, there's no period, there's no semicolon. You'll also notice that I don't indicate, like APA wants, when a particular source was published. I don't provide full URLs, any of that. It's just the author's name and the page number. And the goal here, and this is worth maybe explaining or understanding, and again, this is something I'll discuss as often as I can. If you imagine this within the body of your essay itself, MLA, the goal with signal phrases and in-text citations is to give your reader just enough information that they could then go to your full works cited page and find the entire entry itself. But the goal is not to overburden a reader with so much information that it would perhaps detract from or distract from the reading process itself. And again, I'll give you a visual example of what this looks like, and you could possibly imagine alternatives, but that's really MLA's goal is, well, as you're reading the essay, we want you, the reader, to obviously know when the person who wrote this essay uses borrowed material, but we don't want to overburden you, the reader, with so much information that it detracts from the reading process itself. So let's look at an example, and you can scroll down through this. This is an example of a body paragraph, and the things to pay attention to. So anytime, for example, you see Alexander Sanger states, and then a citation, that should indicate to you that, oh, okay, this is borrowed material. This is not something that the person who wrote this necessarily thinks. They might agree with this, but clearly someone else wrote this. This is someone else's thoughts, ideas, arguments, etc. So part of what's nice about this is how if you just visually assess this paragraph, and we can talk about a blocked quote later, but you'll notice that it's easy to distinguish or differentiate between borrowed material and what the writer perhaps contributes to this paragraph. So for example, this here, Alexander Sanger, and then the citation, that indicates that this, all of this here, not an original thought or idea by the person who wrote this paragraph, but in theory, this is, because there are no citations here. Same principle here. This is a block quote, which again, we'll discuss this later, but the presence of this citation and the presence of this signal phrase indicates that this is also borrowed material. This is not original content produced by the person who wrote this. But because I do not see any citations here, that indicates that all of this is perhaps analysis and development by the person who wrote this. So I think part of what's really great about the signal phrase and citation standards and expectations, it gives your reader a visual indication of when you are borrowing from sources and when you are offering your own original contribution. But what's also nice about it is how you are not overburdening a reader with a lot of citation information. Again, Sanger 80 is far more readable then let us say a full URL. Again, just imagine what that would look like. Visually on the page, I think it would be quite distracting. Visually on the page, it might be hard to read. I think a reader might lose your argument if that's how you created citations within your essay itself. And again, just think about what all of this information within the essay itself does. If I wanted to read this quote in context, which is to say, if this comes from an essay or a book, well, I would just go to the author's works cited page. I would search alphabetically for the name Sanger, and I would see which entries or which entry appears. And because it's a full entry on a works cited page, that's something separate from the essay itself, I would then have all of the information I need to go and find whether that's an essay or a book, a blog entry, whatever it is. So again, just to reiterate this point, the goal within the essay itself, obviously you want to make reference to borrowed material, but you don't want to do so in a way that is distracting and cumbersome. So what you need, signal phrases or a signal phrase introducing a quote or a paraphrase or a summary, and you can use this as an example. So we have our signal phrase, Alexander Sanger states. We have the borrowed material, the language that appears in quotation marks. And then we have this in-text citation. This tells me, again, it reiterates the author's name, and it indicates where in the book or the essay I can find this quote. And it's on page 80, okay? Now, I wanted to give you another example of what this can look like. So this is a book by someone named Rebecca Comey, and I have a digital copy of the book. Here is the full works cited page citation entry. So this is something that would appear after your essay on your works cited page. This is, in theory, all of the information that I need to go and find this book. I know the author's name, the title of the book, who published it, and when it was published. So I could, for example, just take that information. I could Google it. I could go to a library. That's how I would find this. Here is an example of what the signal phrase could look like. Let us say in here, I quote the opening line of the book, which you can read here. The signal phrase could be something simple, like Comey writes. This is the quote itself or the borrowed material. And these are examples of what the citation can look like. Now, I've provided two of these examples because there is one thing to remember that I haven't discussed to this point. If you mention the author's name in the signal phrase, all you need for the citation is the page number. Now, it is not incorrect. You can do this to mention the author's name again, but it's technically unnecessary. So here's an example where I don't mention the author by name in the signal phrase. In the introduction to Morning Sickness, the author writes. Because I use the language the author, I provide their name in the citation. Here is the same example, but for this example, I use the author by name. In the introduction to Morning Sickness, Comey writes. And again, if I wanted to, even though it's technically unnecessary, I could do that if I wanted, okay? So I hope this brief introduction helps. Again, we will discuss this more. If you have questions, please email me or we can discuss it in class later this week. A few additional things I wanted to bring to your attention. I mentioned this earlier. In the research essay module, you'll see I have this document, Signal Phrase Verbs. This is that resource that I mentioned earlier where I said I provided a list of possible signal phrase verbs that you could use so that you could, introduce a bit of variety from time to time. Using the same word, writes and argues repeatedly might become unnecessarily repetitive and redundant. Something else to keep in mind. Here in UJA, and if this isn't your course page, don't fret, you should still have all of this information, even if you're not in this particular course. But if you go to UJA, you'll see that one of the videos that I've created for you incorporating borrowed material, which in a lot of ways is an expansion of what I just discussed here. That video is available to you. So you can use either of those resources. I would definitely encourage you to do so. But again, as you watch this video, definitely take notes of anything that seems confusing, anything that I forgot to explain. Email me, or we can just discuss this in class later this week. So again, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you again for those of you who came to campus today. I am so incredibly sorry that I wasn't able to create that announcement sooner, but yeah, have a good day, and I hope to talk to you soon.